The longer I observe the state of modern gaming, the more I find myself playing older games. Not because I'm looking down the barrel at the wrong end of my 30s, and with age comes a supposed increasing conservatism in entertainment choices, also known to younger people as being set in your ways. Everyone loves when I ramble in a scattergun fashion about a topic I'm passionate about, so strap yourselves in, here I go again. There was a definite feeling of things peaking within the entertainment industry as we careened our way into the 21st century in an uncertain future. Sure, most subsequent works are technically better with their lighting and makeup and effects, but the scripts and our enjoyment of them, less so. And it was no different in the world of the PC. There was a slice of gaming history that stretched from the introduction and subsequent marriage of VGA and multimedia through to the emergence of 3D acceleration that I've already celebrated in a previous video. While that video sets the cutoff point at the end of the DOS era, I think it's fair to say that the first few years of the new century were fantastic for gaming too. In fact, now that I think about it, the machines from the early 2000s are more or less the same as the machines of nowadays. For all your bright lights and liquid cooling and fancy names, they're just faster and prettier versions of what we had back then. I've also talked about how the representational art style of older games is often superior to the attempted photorealism of today's titles, and how it heavily influenced the indie genre that came in its wake. So instead of repeating myself, I'm going to talk about why I think games from the past are better than games coming out now. Let's dispel one illusion though. Just like with film and television, if we're talking on a technical level, there's no contest. Higher frame rates, better resolutions, cross-platform releases, and most titles having 3D acceleration and multi-core support means that modern games are far better in almost every way. And yet, despite having the tools to create something truly spectacular that renders past glories irrelevant, most modern games developers aren't doing that. Amid the thousands of bland to terrible titles that I sift through 4 times a week, there are certain games that cast such a long shadow that they've never been replaced. The most famous of these examples is a game called Doom. Almost everyone knows what Doom is. It's the first-person shooter that shot the genre into the mainstream spotlight, and it's still being played today. You have heard of Doom, right? Go on, look it up. I'll wait. If you also look at the Steam statistics, there's less than 100 people playing it, with 2,000 players instead choosing to enjoy the latest iteration in the series, Doom Eternal. But that doesn't paint the true picture. As with most retro game fanatics, the bulk of classic Doom players don't use the Steam version, because they're angry misanthropes who hate the world. Well, no, that just happens to be a coincidence. It's just more are playing source ports that don't require Steam. A Doom World thread ran various analytics and download numbers and came up with a baseline estimate of 10,000 regular players, with no calculable ceiling. It could be 40,000. It could be 1 million Doom players. The reason for the quadruple digit base number? Doom is Doom. It's not Quake, not Unreal, not Call of Duty, and most certainly not the later Doom games. Sure, it defined and dominated the genre, but it's also really fun to play, and it nails its formula so utterly that people just keep coming back for more. You could say the same for so many games in so many of their respective genres, and almost all of them will fall into that 15-year period. Whether it's the most popular MMO, the best RTS, the greatest RPGs, or first-person shooters. Often you'll hear players dismiss this as lip service or nostalgia. This is true in some cases where a game is heavily reliant on its realistic visuals to sell it at the time, and becomes outdated within a space of a year or two. It also doesn't apply across the board with all genres. When you say open world sandbox crafting, you only think of one game. And it's certainly not from the 90s. There's an importance in many cultures to pay homage to your influences despite their obsolescence. Other older titles get lumped into that category when they aren't obsolete at all, simply because they came out during the same time frame. I think we can take a more objectivist approach to this. Given the right environment and the correct tools, artists can craft a piece of work in any medium that transcends time itself. It happens in the world of art, literature, music, cinema and television. A singular moment where everything comes together to indelibly etch it into the cultural psyche of the world. Irrespective of how you feel and what you believe, the reality is that the world isn't going to forget Da Vinci, the Beatles, Chaplin or Tolkien. So why can we not then apply the same effect to the medium of gaming? Many game creators fight for their work to be interpreted as an art and of cultural importance. The face of Doom Guy is familiar to millions, and will likely remain so for as long as gaming history is preserved. And he's not even the biggest cultural icon, compared to some of the console figures from the same time. I'm not arguing that transcendent works cannot or will not be made in this modern era, but because of the time we live in, there's not going to be as many. Da Vinci was part of the High Renaissance. The Beatles spearheaded the British invasion. Tolkien survived the First World War to return to a heavily industrialised England that informed his future work. And don't even get me started on Charlie Chaplin. All of these iconic artists were a product of their times, and could only have appeared in those times. And this is where we get into generational theory. The first computer games were developed in the early 50s, decades before the likes of John Carmack existed. They were built by the greatest generation, people who had lived through the horrors of World War II and survived. So why am I singling out Carmack's generation as the one of importance instead of the ones responsible for the medium? Because Generation X were the first group to grow up with gaming as a constant part of their childhood, with cassette tapes and lines of code in magazines to program their own copy of a game, where personal computers in the home console market had become a thing, and titles like Space Invaders and Pac-Man were beamed into impressionable synapses by glowing CRT screens. These individuals started to come into their own as designers and developers right around the turn of the 90s. The advent of multimedia personal computing meant the shackles were off, and it provided them with the tools and platform to ascend to greatness. Much like how Steve Wozniak and Paul Allen had to be born in the early 50s to have such a monumental impact on the development of home computing. Cometh the hour, cometh the Doom Guy. Doom could not have been made in the 80s. The technology wasn't there. It was only with the development of sound cards and VGA towards the end of that decade, coupled with the introduction of Intel's clock multiplier in the 486DX2, that allowed for the likes of Doom to run as well as it did. This fertile soil of technological advancement and increasing monetary reward led to the huge milestones of the gaming world. Until that monetary reward became huge in its own right, of course. But how does that make the games better? Because the developers came from a time when none of the rules had been written, and the PC gaming world was a growing niche market of entertainment, catering for the wealthy or educated, rather than appealing to everyone and eclipsing the revenue of film and TV combined. While corporate influence was still a thing, there was more freedom for developers and designers to express themselves outside of a rigidly defined set of gameplay expectations. This led to the subsequent creation and refinement of so many genres. You see the same thing happening today. All the best new ideas are coming from small independent teams, or even one person doing something nobody else thought of first. Though coming first doesn't necessarily mean doing it best. Just look at the vast majority of sports titles that can't hold a candle to their modern equivalents. The exceptions to that rule? Games that didn't focus on graphical realism, and instead went for the distilled gameplay jugular during development. The design and visual style of the games was what set them apart. The artists used representational graphics that worked within the confines of the technology of the time. Pixels, voxels, early shaded and textured 3D, in order to present the player with a clear understanding of what they were viewing. Less was often more, and this was offset by the user interfaces of the time that were more informative without being overwhelming. Contrast this with the need to inject sickness-inducing blur and coloration and post-processing into everything. The attitude of, we have these effects, so why not use them? And increasingly baffling UI choices that frustrate players with their functionalities, or lack of. These are often used as a crutch, as their audiences sport a reduced attention span comparatively, and crave instant gratification. There must be a level of spectacle and accessibility that caters towards immediacy, instead of delaying the dopamine hit and rewarding player ingenuity or comprehension. The result of this has meant there are now less ways to play games than before, as entire genres have been kicked to the curb either due to their difficulty or lack of immediacy. While the underlying technical complexity behind the various engines of modern games has increased, the mechanics involved in the play and the player's ability to interact with them has not. The considered, the measured and the complex has given way to a veneer of glad-handing, where games will repeatedly tell the player that their feats are awe-inspiring, where hard and brutal is seen as the reflexive ability to perform a required action ad nauseum, rather than divining a way to defeat the AI in a given situation. It's no better than the coin-chewing arcades of the 80s. Most modern titles are sold as digital experiences rather than games, because they do not respect the player's intelligence or time. Why should they? They're presenting themselves to a user base of billions instead of millions. So when you see those glowing reviews for the latest big budget title, do take a minute to remember that the audience that it's coming from isn't the crowd you used to play with back in the 90s. Speaking of your old crowd, why would those companies cater to a minority? Why attempt to recreate the gameplay elements that have been ignored when you could just stick to what sells instead? It makes no financial sense. A small piece of a larger pie instead of a large piece of a small pie? Or potentially no pie at all should the player base not be there? No company beholden to board members would be willing to chase that, and few independents have the time or inclination to do so. Yet there are a few. And that's why revival projects in the form of throwback titles, fan games, remakes and source ports are so important. They're filling a small but important gap that has been left open by the profit chasing of others. Right now in this hellscape of deteriorating interpersonal relationships and increasing financial hardship, there are a series of people so dissatisfied with the way things are now that they've taken it upon themselves to remedy that instead of just basking in the nostalgia of the past. And the result may never make them millionaires, but it has made a lot of that old 90s crew happy as they slide into an uncomfortable middle age fraught with peril and fear. With viruses and war and economic and societal suffering on a grand scale, and with the gradual introduction of augmented virtual reality and near-sentient AI, perhaps we're reaching a tipping point where the next Carmack will appear. Let me just look up who's been working on these things. Artificial General Intelligence, Oculus... Oh, apparently one Carmack is enough, he'll just do it again. In the meantime, before his breakthrough, there's an entire world of ways to play games. Don't let the modernization of gaming deny you the opportunity to realize what's been lost in the process. And while gaming may have peaked as an industry decades ago, for now, keep your eyes peeled for those cluster of niche titles that might just adhere to the design philosophy that has been ruthlessly kicked to the curb in the name of greed.